All right, guys, so today we're going to review the PowerPoint on Chapter 10, Lesson 2, and that's dealing with heredity. Okay, we're going to talk about what heredity is here shortly. And this is covered in pages 392 through 397 in your text. So, on 392, so we're looking at what did Gregor Mendel observe. So if you read through that like you should have, hey, you'll know that he was a Austrian monk, okay, who basically was studying genetics in the monastery's garden, okay, and he started experimenting with pea plants. Okay, so again, as you should have read, we know that heredity, okay, is the passing of physical characteristics or phenotypes, okay, from parents to offspring. And we know that this is done through fertilization, okay, mixing the genetic information from both parents and creating an offspring that is similar to both parents but not identical. So in his discoveries, this is where he actually formed the foundation of genetics. He's actually considered the godfather of genetics, which is the study of heredity. Okay. So again, going back, back a little bit from when we were in school, the process of an egg joining a sperm cell, is fertilization. All right. And in plants, for fertilization to take place, pollination has to happen. So passing the pollen from the stamen of one plant to the pistil of another. Those are the male and female parts of a plant. So we're going to get into a little bit of how Gregor Mendel did this in pea plants. So if we look at a purebred, probably easiest if we use the example with dogs. If we'll pick Rocket. Rocket's sitting right next to me. So if I breed a Jack Russell Terrier with a Jack Russell Terrier, what am I going to get? A Jack Russell. And we take those puppies, and then we breed them with just Jack Russell, and we're going to continue to get a purebred dog. All right. Now, if we take, let's say, a Jack Russell, and actually we'll go Bulldog. Okay. So we take a Bulldog and we breed it with a Shih Tzu. Do we still have a purebred? Absolutely not. We have what's called a hybrid. Okay. And you can figure out what you get when you breed a Bulldog with a Shih Tzu. Hopefully that got a little laugh out. That usually is a pretty good one in class. So anyway, purebred organism is when the offspring of many generations show the same trait. Like I said, with Jack Russells breeding with Jack Russells, we continue to get that same trait, that small terrier. So he was looking at this in pea plants. So there's the example in your book. And I actually found one on the internet as well. So the first thing he did was to prevent self-pollination, because plants often self-pollinate, and they have male and female parts on their plant, on the flower itself. So what he did, he removed the stamen here. Okay. So these are the the organs that receive the pollen. And so what he did, he cut those off. And then he cross-fertilized a pea plant with white flowers with one that has purple flowers. And to do that, he used a brush, and he took the pollen from the white flowered plant and put it on the pistil of the purple flowered pea plant. So now it's pollination. That's essentially fertilization. So he noticed that the egg cells in the pink flower were fertilized by the sperm and the white flower. And so over time, the pods started to form. Okay? And this is an example of a dominant form of the trait, and we're going to get into that here toward the end of this video. Okay? So in pea plants, the purple flower was the dominant color, and the white flower was the recessive color. Okay? So like I said, we're going to get into that here shortly. So talking about offspring and the first two generations. So the P represents the parental generation. All right. So these are purebred organisms in this case plants. Okay. F1 denotes the first generation. So if we took, like when Mendel did that purebred purple flower plant and the purebred white flower plant, that would represent the parental generation. Their offspring is going to represent the F1 generation. Okay? And their offspring represents the F2 generation. And you can follow along on 394 in your textbook, and it goes through that with tall and short pea plants, which is another one of the traits that he experimented with. So what Mendel did is, if you look on 394, he crossed a purebred tall plant with a purebred short plant, and the F1 generation, he noticed that only one form of the trait appeared, the dominant trait. Okay, so all of the F1 generation were tall, and because that happened to be the dominant trait. Then when the F1 generation, when they had offspring, he noticed that the F2 generation lost that dominant trait about a quarter of the time. Okay, so about 1 in 4 of the F2 generation were short plants. And we're going to talk about why that is in a second here, because it's dealing with alleles, which are different forms of a specific gene. So if you look here, okay, this is a diagram that you have in your book. Okay, this is the P1 or the P generation. Okay, here we have our purebred tall plant. Okay, purebred we know because it has two dominant forms of the allele, capital T, capital T. You guys should remember we've talked about this a little bit. Okay, where a capital letter denotes the dominant form of the allele. And our short plant here has two lowercase t's, okay? And that's the recessive form of the allele. So he crossbred these two and noticed in the F1 generation, they were all tall. Notice, though, they're not purebred anymore, okay? Purebred, two of the same, purebred, two of the same. The F1 generation created hybrids, okay? So they have one form of the dominant allele, and they also have one form of the recessive allele. Let me make sure you guys can see this here. So in the F1 generation, we end up with capital T, lowercase t. Okay, so again, that is a hybrid plant. So when the F1 generation made offspring, okay, now we have two hybrids, capital T, lowercase t, capital T, lowercase t, okay, creating offspring. And notice, okay, that about a quarter of the time, that recessive trait showed up. All right, and we've done Punnett squares before, if you remember, with blood types, and I'm going to show you how we can create the or look at the probability of this happening. Okay, so again, parent generation, the F1, we know the recessive allele never shows up in the F1 generation, and in the F2 generation, it shows up about a quarter of the time. All right, so alleles, if you remember from the first lesson, okay, they are the type of, it's the type of trait, okay, that's coded for by a gene. All right, and again, we can have dominant, codominant, or recessive, and we'll get into that as we continue on in our study of genetics. If you look here, these are the traits, the 7 traits that Mendel studied in these pea plants. Okay, so he studied the seed shape and found that round was dominant to wrinkled. And he studied the color and noticed that yellow was dominant over green. Okay, color of the pea pod itself, green was actually dominant over yellow. Okay, a full pod was dominant over a pinched or wrinkled pod. Okay, tall dominant over short, and the leaves or the flowers at the side of the stems was dominant over flowers at the tips of the branches, and flower color, purple was dominant over white. Okay, so again, these physical characteristics here, these are called phenotypes. Okay, and then the 2 different forms of the gene, the capital letter, lowercase letter, okay, that is the genotype, and we're going to get into that here a little bit later on. So again, we talked about getting 1 allele from the female parent and 1 allele from the male parent. All right, and again, if there is a dominant and recessive form of that allele, the dominant will hide or overpower the recessive trait and showing the dominant physical characteristics. Okay, so again, here is pretty close to what you have in your book. Okay, so you can see here where the dominant, in the P generation, we had purebred round seed crossed with purebred wrinkle seed, and in the F1 generation, round seed showed up. Okay, so in that case, what is going to be the dominant form of the allele here? Round, okay, because we know that the recessive trait never shows up in the F1 generation. Seed color, crossed yellow with green, got yellow, dominant. Okay, gray crossed with white. Hopefully you're catching on here. It appears that the dominant are all at the top. Okay, so dominant, dominant, axial meaning the side of the stems, terminal meaning on the tips, and then tall, dominant over short again. We know it's the dominant trait because it is what shows up in the F1 generation. And that was page 395. So looking at genes and alleles. Okay, so here we have our chromosome. Okay, we have our sister chromatids. Okay, okay, we know that homologous means same. Okay, so this 1 came from the male parent and 1 came from the female parent. And these are the genes. Okay, so the genes are actually in specific locus or location on that chromosome. All right, so the chromatid that you had from dad, okay, and mom, they both have a gene in that same section. Here, this happens to be 2 recessive forms of the gene. Okay, so the recessive trait would show up if this happened to be a pea plant. Okay, and this was for a round seed. Okay, then we get that recessive form of the allele. Okay, so here's another locus or location of an allele. These are both the dominant form of the allele. So here we have homozygous dominant, homo meaning they're the same, capital letter, dominant. This is homozygous recessive. Okay. Here again, homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive. Here we have a heterozygous situation. Okay, so we have the recessive form of the allele from dad, the dominant form of the trait from mom. Okay, so we end up with this. Okay, that will still produce the dominant phenotype or the dominant physical characteristic. Okay, so again, the genes control the inherited traits, and like I just went over, the alleles are different forms of the gene. So this is one allele, this is another allele. Okay. Again, we have, like I just explained, some alleles are dominant while others are recessive. Okay, let me go back here. And so here are two dominant forms of the allele, two recessive forms of the allele. And here we have a recessive and dominant form. Okay, so homozygous recessive, homozygous dominant, and heterozygous. And those are very important terms that we need to remember throughout this entire chapter. So the symbols for the allele, like I talked about, dominant is represented by a capital letter. Okay, and if the dominant trait, if the dominant form of the allele is present, it will always show up in the organism, okay, because it overpowers or hides the recessive trait. Okay, the recessive alleles shown by lowercase letters, okay, and the recessive traits are hidden whenever the dominant allele is present. Okay, so example here, okay, purple is dominant to white. Okay, here we have homozygous dominant, okay, capital W, and we get the dominant form of the trait, okay, the phenotype. We get a purple flower. Phenotype is the physical characteristic. The genotype is the two different letters. Those are the different pairs of alleles. So here we have, okay, purebred or homozygous dominant. Okay, here we have a hybrid. All right, so if we look, and we have the dominant form of the allele here. Oh, let me go back. Sorry. We have the dominant form of the allele here, and then the lowercase or recessive form of the allele. All right, so if you remember, that is called heterozygous. Okay, but because the dominant form is present, we get the dominant phenotype or physical characteristic. Okay, so we still get a purple flower. The only way in this case that we can get a white flower is to have two recessive forms of the allele. Okay, so if we look here, lowercase w, all right, that gives us two recessive alleles. Now we get the recessive trait, or the white flower in this case. All right, so our phenotype would be white flower. Our genotype would be lowercase w. Okay, these are very, very important terms, especially when we get into the next lesson that deals with probability and how to predict the particular outcomes for mating when two different individuals, okay, when they breed. Okay, understand in humans, not nearly this simple. We have very, very, very few phenotypes or physical characteristics that are controlled by a single gene and two alleles. Okay, most of our traits, our physical characteristics, or phenotypes are a combination of multiple genes all working together to create a physical trait. All right, And we'll get into that a little deeper in lesson 3 from chapter 10. Okay, so if you have any questions, post them here, and hey, have a great one.